Okay, welcome to this lesson on David Hockney, double figure paintings of the 1970s. And just a few words by way of introduction to the subject. David Hockney, perhaps the most popular contemporary British painter, born in Bradford in 1930, studies first of all at Bradford School of Art in the 1950s, works very assiduously, incredibly hard worker, was in the Life drawing room, all the time, was drawing well into the night, always had a pencil in his hand, and his innate abilities obviously just flourished in an environment like that. Wins a place to the Royal College of Art to study painting in the late 50s, early 60s. His contemporaries at the Royal College, amongst them was the British artist Derek Boshier, and who also now lives in Los Angeles. But even before Hockney leaves the Royal College of Art, he's selling his paintings. He has interest from galleries, and with the sale of or the prize win, buys his first ticket to New York. It's probably in about 1960, 61, 62, and basically falls in love with this, with America and American culture. And before very long, he's living in Los Angeles. This is shortly after leaving the Royal College of Art. And he lives in Los Angeles for many, many years. And during the 1960s and 70s, basically lives between Los Angeles and London. And the paintings that we are going to look at today are made both in London and in Los Angeles. So the first painting I want to look at is this one. It's called American Collectors. And the thing to say about all these paintings are they're usually of a fairly uniform size. That's to say 7 feet by 10 feet, 7 feet high, 10 feet across. And invariably, at this period, they're made in acrylic, applied in various ways, sometimes painted and sometimes I think he uses a spray diffuser. But the thing to say about this painting is, and indeed all of the paintings, is their strong compositional structure. When he was at the Royal College, Hockney became very interested in the iconography of Egyptian tomb paintings and the kind of the flatness of the space and the kind of the frieze-like procession of figures. In Egyptian tomb painting, the figures are painted in a very two-dimensional way, and they process across the walls of the tomb. So that the figures are read either left to right or up and down. There's no reading of space, illusionistic space, of going into the depth of an image. And so that kind of pictorial arrangement of space influenced Hockney a great deal in his earlier paintings at the Royal College, and there's a residue of it you see here, because we read this painting as almost as a stage set, one space. If you can imagine like a stage curtain, and then you've got the scenery behind that, and the scenery behind that, and the scenery behind that. So there are these different planes of space which are overlaying one another, as you get with stage scenery in a theatre. So we have here, as it were, the first layer of space, which is the patio courtyard, where these two wealthy, affluent American collectors have their sculpture. I think that this one is by Isamu Noguchi, I believe. And the composition is kind of reinforced by the almost sort of rigidity of the male figure. Again, painted almost as a sort of structural element and shown profile on, much like you would find in Egyptian tomb paintings. His wife is looking at us some distance further into the canvas, and beyond them is their modernist house with another piece of sculpture and some maybe reference to a possible Barnett Newman painting. The windows of their house, which occupies, as it were, the third zone of space. The first zone of space is the male figure with the sculpture. The second zone of space is his wife with the tree and the plant pot. And then the third zone of space is their modernist house. And then beyond that, you've got the Native American Indian totem pole. But just before we leave this painting, two things to say, to take from it. First of all, he's basically showing the light of California, these strong shadows, and the simplification of the image. So he doesn't bother with sort of faffy details. There's a lovely conciseness and an editorial action that's taking place within his thinking about images and about how he paints these images. And he uses graphic devices to indicate. So, for example, in the windows here, graphic devices indicate reflections on a glass surface. But most importantly of all is the pictorial structure, the pictorial composition and arrangement of space. So if we look, the horizontal divisions are 1, 2, the horizontals are on the thirds. So the patio area is 1/3, 2/3, 3. That's a third up the pictorial space. And the vertical divisions are 1, 2, 3, 4. They're about a fifth. So it's 1 to 3 and about 1 to 5. 1 to 3 horizontally, 1 to 5 vertically. So this is painted in 1968. And then in 1970, Hockney has a house in Powys Terrace. And I'm not sure whether this famous portrait was painted in Powys Terrace or at the Clark's own home. Now, Ozzie Clark and Celia Birtwell were very well-known fashion designers in the early 1970s. And Hockney makes this iconic double portrait painting of them in 1971. It's now hanging in Tate London, Tate Millbank. And it's again 7 feet by 10 feet, acrylic on canvas. And it's in art terms, it's known as a kind of a conversation piece. And you've only got to think of presidents in art like Thomas Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, which is also in the Tate, of a couple of aristos in the 18th century surveying the lands they own. Well, this in a way is a sort of a companion sort of piece to that type of art. It makes a nod to that type of painting, because we have here the kind of glitterati of 1970s creative London. And they're both friends of Hockney's. And they're the kind of the new cultural aristocracy of London. And the painting is a very refined piece of painting. The surfaces of the painting are very carefully worked. And you can see when we go into like the details of this painting. So here is Celia Birtwell, and Hockney is not afraid of sort of counterposing exquisite detail like you see in the still life with the flowers, with very large open areas of space. And the thing to say about Hockney's painting of this time is, of course, the big trend at the time was for what is called post-painterly abstraction. Now that was basically originated in America, but it was basically sort of lots of sort of what is known as field painting, color field painting, great expanses of canvas covered just in one color. And you can see the influence of that on Hockney, that he's kind of, he is and has always been a figurative artist, but he was aware of the predominant trends in painting at the time. That's to say, this abstract color field painting. And so you see him kind of absorbing some of those influences. So for example, in the wall areas, we've got these quite unbroken fields of color. So there's like this warm underpainting, this orangey brown underpainting that I suspect is under a lot of the painting. And then over it, he's kind of, he's sort of scumbled the kind of the powder blue. It's possibly either scumbling, which is a dry brush technique, or he might have been using some kind of spray diffuser. So he's basically articulating large unbroken areas of colour with much more detailed, beautifully exquisite, carefully painted still life passages of painting there. And the exquisite way that he's dealt with Celia Birtwell. So if you were to go up close, for example, to the hair is painted sometimes with single strokes of a very thin brush, just to get those highlights. The exquisite way he's created the reflected light on the left-hand side of her face. These tones of like lilacs, violets, with some of the kind of the smoky mushroom colours that you get in the sort of underpainting of her face there. The beautiful simplistic kind of way the light is falling on the dress. Ozzy Clark, a lovely human touch with Percy the cat. But the thing I want to say about this detail of the painting is how he is editing and paring down unnecessary detail. So if we go into an even close up, notice the way the hand there is painted. No unnecessary detail. One colour for the back of the hand. Just some highlights for the knuckles. The face is painted with probably about three tones. The jumper again, 2 to 3 tones, dark tone, mid tone, and light tone. And the jumper is, but it looks like some of the jumper is painted wet into wet, so he's blending the colour on those highlights, just to get that lovely soft focus that you get with folds of material. The beautiful way he's painted the light on the illuminated right hand. Again, notice the colour in the shadow, that kind of mushroomy brown overlaid with a blue, and then he's basically mixed the colour with some ochre and white and created this lovely highlight of the hand. Some beautiful kind of different textures that he's created. So the smoothness of the trousers, again, very carefully working from he takes the dark shadow of the trousers there, then he starts adding some lighter green, some white, adding to that green, and you can see he gradually gradates across the surface of the trousers to virtually near white highlight there. Percy the cat has this stippling to create the effect of the fur coat. And look how he's juxtaposing textures, the shininess of the chair arm. Again, very carefully wrought grading colours. So this is not sort of painterly slapdash way of painting. He's working these surfaces very carefully. The paint is applied fairly thinly, and he works in a very kind of deliberate, precise, concise way, where colours are mixed, possibly on a palette, and then applied one against the other to create this sense of form and volume. And the thing to say about this way of painting is it's a graphic way of, I mean, Hockney, like a lot of great artists, Picasso, Van Gogh, was what is known as a sort of graphic painter. That's to say, his paintings derive from his draftsmanship, and the paint is applied in a fairly careful, deliberate, precise manner, as opposed to, for example, great painters like Rembrandt, who where the paint is pushed around much more, and the actual painting method is much more what is known as painterly. So Hockney is a graphic painter, and that explains a lot of how his images come into being. He thinks in drawing terms. So we have him here standing against a portrait he did of his parents, and this gives you just a sense of the exquisite refinement of his painting style when he was making these double figure paintings. And notice how he's using colour, the modulations of colour to create those folds. So he's using sort of warm violets against kind of mushroomy browns, and then bluey violets, and then he's diluting, or rather mixing those bluey violets with whites. So this kind of symphony of different colours is creating the folds and the form and the volume to these figures. Here's the entire portrait. Again, composition, very important. There's a lovely balance, serenity, harmony that you get with these paintings. And quite interesting to do with the way he arranges sitters. So in the case of Mr. and Mrs. Clark, again, the figures perform a compositional role. Don't forget how horizontals and verticals, the way he's divided up the canvas. In both cases in this painting, Mr. and Mrs. Clark are looking at us, the viewer. But for example, so the gaze is a sort of triangular gaze, the base of the triangle being the relationship between Ozzie Clark and Celia Birtwell, and our relationship with them looking at us and us looking at them. So we're at the apex of that triangle. The setup with the parents is somewhat different. So his mother, who was a very, very strong woman, is looking directly out at us. And look at that beautiful, like, formal, symmetrical structure placed right over on the left-hand side of the canvas. Now, if he had kind of followed the, maybe as in like Egyptian painting, for example, and just placed another seated figure his father seated, staring round at us. That would have really flattened up the space. No, no, no. He's far too sophisticated a painter for that. So he basically he mixes up the spatial dynamics of the painting, and he creates this sort of richness of pictorial space. So he has his father sitting obliquely to us, diagonally to us, and the gaze, his father's gaze, is at a book David Hockney has given his father, and his mother is the sitter with whom we engage as the viewer of the painting. So basically, we're led into this sort of circular space. His father, and behind him, the mobile chest of drawers on wheels, and then brought to his mother, who's looking direct out at us. Some hint, as in, for example, the Arnolfini marriage, of a mirror in the space, which again reflects back out at us. Just an interesting detail, it looks like the painting reflected in the mirror is a reproduction of Piero della Francesca's Baptism of Christ, which had a profound influence on Hockney, that painting also being in the National Gallery, and possibly a painting that he was thinking of in the making of his paintings at this time. Hockney painted friends, so this epic double portrait, and here in juxtaposition to the last one, we actually have a situation where he has arranged both viewers who are face on to us, but very cleverly. This, by the way, is Christopher Isherwood, the famous British writer, went to Berlin in the 1930s. A lot of his writings are about experiences in Berlin in the 1930s, and that's his lover, Don Bashady. And they lived in Los Angeles and were obviously living in the same city as David Hockney, and Hockney got introduced to Isherwood and then paints this double portrait. Beautiful kind of sort of sense of the way our eye is led into the space of the sitters. So we have the perspective of this tabletop on which are formally placed two piles of books, and that leads the eye further into Christopher Isherwood and Don Bashady. So our eye is taken into this sort of mid-ground space, and then the gaze. So there's a sort of, the triangulation is that the gaze is, although both figures are facing at us, Hockney, by a very sort of savvy knowledge of pictorial dynamics, flicks Isherwood's gaze to Don Bashady. So the gaze goes from Isherwood to Bashady, Bashady out to us, and us back to Isherwood. So again, he's setting up this triangulation of the gazes of the sitters and our gaze on the painting, and this marvelous sort of little detail of the fruit in the bowl, yellow fruit, which is playing off color and palette wise with the surrounding sort of muted greys and that kind of buff color behind. And then the third space behind, set up by this glorious cerulean blue against the sort of like sandy khaki colors. So this is painting of the utmost sophistication. Light coming in from the right and hitting Isherwood's shirt, that glorious white reflection that you get. Large areas again of open space counterposed with exquisite areas of detail in the faces, the hands. So, you know, a masterpiece of Hockney, this painting. Another double figure portrait, this time of Henry Geldof, who was a friend of Hockney's and the director of the Museum of Modern Art in the late 60s, early 70s. Just to give you some idea of the scale of the painting, that's how large it is. But what I want to say about this one, apart from the composition, again, notice 1/3, 2/3. It's about probably 1, 2, 3, probably about quarters horizontally, and the way it's divided vertically. So 1, 2, 3. It's probably thirds, roughly thirds. Again, the vertical figure. Almost something quite surreal about that vertical figure is punctuating this space to the right. The sitter, the main sitter, is virtually stuck, virtually just off center, and it's almost a vertical line going down. But most importantly, Hockney's using graphic devices to actually describe the space, the surface of the glass tables with these diagonal lines. Just aware of time, so I'm going to move on a bit. This is a double portrait of Wayne Sleep and I think Mr. Dawson, who's a musician, a composer. Wayne Sleep, of course, the famous dancer, but this glorious open empty space to the right, the light coming in from the left. Notice the kind of the verticality, one figure sitting, the gaze of the figures and how that's directed in this case. Here's a detail, and notice the pure simplicity. So he doesn't mess about with details. You know, the eyes are just kind of like shadows, basically. Simple shadow of the hair, very pared down, simplified, edited rendering of the face, the way the folds on the. So he provides you with enough detail, but he never burdens you with detail. And he always juxtaposes areas of detail with lovely, open, clear areas where the eye can rest. Another portrait of Henry Geldof, you know, art connoisseur, looking amongst others at paintings, including one by Piero della Francesca. You can assume that all these artists are very important to Hockney, and you can see certainly Vermeer and Piero della Francesca featuring very heavily in the way Hockney's thinking about the composition of his paintings at this time. Another less well-known double portrait from the 1970s. I'm not sure if that one's in Paris. I think here a commissioned portrait. And again, he's setting up these wonderful kind of surfaces, steel against glass, tulips. This is the beautiful way he's painted that still life, the reflection, the simplification. Robert Hughes once said of Hockney, you know, if not the Mozart of modern painting, then perhaps it's Cole Porter. Well, I mean, I think I was perhaps a bit harsh. I think Hockney is both Mozart and Cole Porter. But I've come here now to talk about a painting I want to discuss in a bit further detail. This is the artist and a figure by Paul, very famous painting that he made in the 1970s. And this is a masterpiece of Hockney's painting of this time. He painted it in, I think, in about 3 weeks. It's 7 feet by 10 feet. And we see here a detail of how the painting started to happen. So he actually had to go to France to actually photograph, I think, some of the scenes of these paintings, this painting. So he's obviously painted the figure in the pool first, and by the look of the spray gun there, it's possible that you can see the figure, the body. I think he's basically, some of it is painted, they sort of like these lovely cool pinks, and then he's sprayed gun the blue shadow, and then graphically he's painted over those beautiful lines, the way the light's catching the pool. And he's probably used a lot of either wet into wet and spray gun technique for the for the water. I mean, I think he once described using a mixture of detergent, washing up liquid or detergent, and diluted acrylic, and that, I think, gives you a very kind of aqueous feel to acrylic paint when it's applied to canvas. I think in this case, I'm not sure if it's linen canvas or cotton duck. Anyway, he then, you can see, proceeds to work on the patio terrace around the swimming pool. Looks like a lot of the details of the background haven't been put in yet. But it's the figure on the right, who is his lover at the time, Peter Schlesinger, and he met in California. And this is a wonderful, I mean, he photographed Schlesinger, I think probably taken from a photograph in Hyde Park, but he uses that photograph for this painting. Look again at the very careful, refined way he's creating the texture of the jacket, the folds on this pink jacket, that wonderful sort of, the way he's mixed the pink with this white, and that, the way the light is catching that lapel, and he's offsetting that kind of illuminated part of the lapel against the lilac of the jumper underneath. The hair is painted with a sort of darker underpainting, and then almost single strokes are painted into so you can see here some of the process of this. So this darker underpainting, and then he's going in with sort of like warmer tones like oranges, and then the lighter tones, the highlights come right at the end. And he's working with a brush, so a lot of it is brushed in, and then these sort of like highlights, you can see these highlights sort of dragged in, perhaps with a single, like what are called a liner's brush, which is very, very thin brush, and you just drag it through wet paint to get that effect, that softening effect. And then by now he's obviously added all this wonderful foliage and texture. So in short, this is just a very brief overview of a series of paintings that Hockney made in the 1970s. I would like to acknowledge the sources of some of these images, in particular the trustees of Tate London. And this is an installation view of the exhibition that was at Tate London. I don't think this was from Tate, but there was a show about 10 years ago at Tate, and one room was devoted to Hockney's double figure paintings of this time. And you can see here, to give you some idea of the scale of them, and it's glorious to see them as an ensemble group of paintings. This particular one, the artist by the pool, sold, I think, for about $90 million at auction in the past 2 or 3 years. The most expensive painting by a living artist. But just in conclusion, the thing to take away from Hockney's painting of this period is its exquisite refinement of composition and his application of paint, and the calmness and serenity that is invested, inherent in these paintings. I'm just going to finish with just a last look at this painting of the artist and double figure at the pool. And it's these spaces that are being set up, the space of looking through water to a figure in the water. So you can see both the surface of the water and you can look through